everyone is asking whether Michael Penix will take a year 2 leap. But I'm wondering if the rest of the Atlanta Falcons are good enough to make the playoffs. We'll discuss on today's edition of Locked On NFL.
The new Locked On NFL. The madman Tyler Rowland is your double shot of NFL espresso, with the Locked On local experts on every major story. Get ready, Rowland is revving up. The new Locked On NFL starts now. Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Football fans, welcome in to today's edition of Locked On NFL, bringing you a double dose of the NFL's biggest stories with help from our local experts that know your favorite teams like no one else. I am your host, the madman, Tyler Rowland, joined today by Locked On NFL expert, The Legacy, Louis DiBiase. On today's show, we are going to continue our biggest question series. We're going to talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars and whether they've course-corrected enough to make some noise. Talk about whether the Texans can get CJ Stroud back on track, but we'll start with the Atlanta Falcons and whether the Atlanta Falcons are good enough around Michael Penix to make some noise on their own in the NFC South. But before we dive into all of that, I do want to thank you for making Locked On NFL your first listen and for being an everydayer here with us at the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Louis, looking at the Atlanta Falcons, I know that when we talk about the biggest question, what's the biggest question for the Atlanta Falcons? Most people are immediately going to go to Michael Penix. But I want to look at everything he has around him. A pretty good offensive line with a guy like Chris Lindstrom and Caleb McGarry and, Jake Matthews, who's been a stalwart there. Some pretty good weapons with Darnell Mooney and Drake London, and you add in Bijan Robinson in the backfield. Tyler Algier is a guy that I think is underrated because fantasy people hate him so much for vulturing Bijan Robinson's opportunities.
I'm that guy.
Right, but Tyler Algier is a solid back. So you have Kyle Pitts at tight end. I know he hasn't lived up to the top 5 draft, but Kyle Pitts is still a solid NFL tight end. My thing is, you look at that cast, shouldn't that be good enough for us to get real answers on Michael Penix right away?
I think so. The big question, and it is the low-hanging fruit, but can Michael Penix in year 2 take a roster that I think is ready to win now, that's ready to compete with Tampa Bay in the NFC South? It's actually my favorite roster in that division over Tampa. Is Michael Penix good enough to elevate them to win the division? I think he's a high-floor player that can. They almost made the playoffs last year when he was a rookie, and I saw some good things on tape. My question is, will he ever be great? I think he's always going to be a good quarterback, and I'm not just saying this because he's a lefty, but he does kind of give me Tua vibes. Like, will he ever be good enough when he's playing the other elite quarterbacks in the league to get it done? But Atlanta's roster is ready to win now, and it's not just the offense, Tyler. I love what they did on defense. This team always has issues when it comes to getting to the quarterback. They add both Jalen Walker and James Pierce in this draft class. They brought in Leonard Floyd through free agency. I like Arnold Ibikidi, back-to-back 6-sack seasons. I think they're a roster ready to go now. I think the questions truly are, who is Michael Penix in year 2?
See, that's the way that I see it as well. Now, just for a little bit of a counter argument here, my guy, Aaron Freeman from Locked On Falcons, sounds like he kind of does see it the other way, where he's a little bit more worried about the other parts around Michael Penix.
Real issues aside, it's also true when it comes to football, because football, as we know, is often called the ultimate team sport because you have 22 players interacting on a single play. That means there's at least 22 variables that impact the outcome of a single play. And over the course of a game that features 140 some odd plays, that means you have over 3,000 variables that impact the outcome of a game, and one individual is technically only responsible for about 5% of those variables. Now, the quarterback is probably more responsible or has more influence on a larger swath of those variables, but he's still hyper dependent on the rest of the team. And I bring all of this up because we haven't spent a lot of time talking about this offseason, but there's certainly a world where we walk away feeling great about Michael Penix, but the team still doesn't reach their goals this upcoming season. Right? There's a situation where Penix absolutely balls out, but he can't necessarily overcome the circumstances like we saw in his first 3 starts over his next 17 starts, where this team continues to sort of hover around 500, despite the fact that they have, a really talented young quarterback. Right. And, I understand why a lot of people believe that because of Michael Penix's impending greatness, that this team is destined overall to win 10 plus games this year, because a lot of people look at football as like your success is entirely dependent on the quarterback. Again, the quarterback is the big factor, but probably we can guesstimate, we can debate it or whatnot, but probably is only 35 to 50% of the pie and whatnot. And there's other 50% that, matters as well. And to me, my questions about the Falcons are about the other 50%, less so than the Michael Penix part of that pie.
Look, and Aaron is one of the most knowledgeable guys on the network, and especially with his Falcons, but I guess I just push back on the idea that I feel comfortable with Penix. And you're right. He is a high floor player. I think he's going to be – it's funny because they get him after they sign Kirk Cousins, and I think he could maybe be a Kirk Cousins level player, but that's just what I think. I think it's likely that it's that, but to act like we know that already and to look at some of the other more bona fide I have more questions about Michael Penix than Jake Matthews. I have more questions about Michael Penix than Drake London or Bijan Robinson, the defense. Yeah, you could make that argument. I don't like their defense necessarily as much as you do because they're so reliant in the pass rush on young players, and I have to bring this up. I bring this up every time we talk about the Falcons because it's insane. Matt Williamson from Peacock and Williamson first brought this to my attention in their show, but 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, the Atlanta Falcons, least amount of sacks in the NFL. So You're right, but can that big gamble that they made on trading up to get James Pierce and then taking Jalen Walker earlier, you do think that that's enough to kind of fix the pass rush enough for this team to maybe be a playoff contender?
Yeah, I think, and it's very projection based, right? Because for me, James Pierce is somebody that is what I thought was the best pass rusher in the draft outside of Abdul Carter. So for me, I do think that he's a guy that was worth trading next year's first round pick for. I think Jalen Walker was one of the best edge rushers in this class. It is projection based, but when you combine those two with the proven ability of Leonard Floyd and Ibikiti as the fourth guy in that rotation, that's great to me. Is he a number one guy in a rotation? No, but had 6 sacks last year, had 6 sacks his rookie year. He's only in his third year as a former second-round pick. I loved their draft pick on day 2 of Xavier Watts. I think the best ball-hawking safety in that class. Plus you have A.J. Terrell. You have some proven players like Jesse Bates back there. I push back as well on Aaron's point. I think that Falcons roster, if you compare it to last year's Commanders team that Jaden Daniels took all the way to the NFC Championship, I think this Falcons team has a lot more pieces. So if Penix is supposed to be that guy in the same class that Daniels was, then the Falcons have more than enough to compete in the NFC. I think if you're comparing their roster to a lot of other teams on that tier, like Chicago and Green Bay, Los Angeles, Arizona, Washington, it's right there. So I don't, he's the Falcons guy, and I believe what he's saying, and I trust him, but I like the roster on paper. It's on paper, but I really like it.
Yeah, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I think it's one of the most talented offenses outside of, if you take away the quarterback, that's like a top 7, top 8 offense, just in terms of talent, solid offense. I didn't know that maybe the offensive line has taken a step back in the last couple of years. Maybe Kyle Pitts hasn't stepped up, but man, I think you'd have a hard time finding anybody to say the supporting cast, not good enough for Michael Penix to really show us who he is and get a true evaluation. No, you're going to get that, and I think we're going to know right out of the gate what we're going to see from Michael Penix. But the question becomes, how do you follow that up? Because right out of the gate, we saw a great season from C.J. Stroud at the Houston Texans, and then the sophomore year didn't feel so good. Can the Texans get C.J. Stroud back on track? That's probably their biggest question heading into the offseason, and we'll talk about how that question might get answered. Today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Have you ever checked your bank account and wondered, where did all my money go? Look, with Monarch Money, you can stop having that feeling forever, whether you're growing your savings or you're trying to plan for a big purchase. Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, and You can stop just managing your money and you can start building wealth. Look, when I first started using Monarch, I didn't realize just how much money I was spending on online shopping. Now I do. I can budget smarter. Again, I can plan for long-term goals. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. All right, Louis, let's continue today's edition of Locked On NFL, doing the biggest question series here as we head towards training camp. We talked about the Atlanta Falcons. Does Michael Penix have enough to show us who he is? We both think, me and Louis, that he does. But now we got to talk about another team who is trying to get their quarterback on track. But this time, it comes after a fantastic rookie year and a little bit of a letdown in year two. But my guy, John Hickman from Locked On Texans, he isn't as convinced that C.J. Stroud had a down year.
Still top 10 in passing first downs during 2024 regular season, pressured 175 times, and still did everything that he possibly could to keep drives alive. I mean, without C.J. Stroud, you kind of wonder, like, hey, man, what would the Houston Texans offense look like? And that's also considering that they were out. Well, they were without Nico Collins for about 5 games, without Stephon Diggs for the second half of the year, Tank Dell in and out, and then we lose Tank Dell at the end of the season. Pressured 175 times, still top 10 in passing first downs, despite ranking top 10 in the NFL in drop passes. C.J. Stroud still had a very decent, I would say, good year. The expectations made his sophomore year look a little bit, I would say maybe less favorable than what most people wanted to see. And I get it by a lot of metrics and numbers. CJ had a down year. And in some ways he did. Like, you can use the eye test or you can use the stats test. CJ didn't have the type of year that his rookie year, that he had with his rookie year. But I think people looked at those numbers being down as an indicator that maybe the impact he had on the game for the Texans might have not been as impactful as his rookie year. And I'm here to tell you, imagine if any of the other quarterbacks on the roster had to carry and lift the 2024 offense.
See, and I get that. The Texans' offensive line did deteriorate, especially on the interior, and you get Nico Collins hurt, Diggs hurt, Tank Dell hurt. Like, that is a lot to come back from, but the question is, how do you get that back on track? Have they done enough to get C.J. Stroud back on track? And quite frankly, Louis, looking at their moves this offseason, I kind of think they've gone the opposite direction of what they should have done. They've kind of stacked the skill position players as much as they possibly can, and then they went super cheap Moneyball style on the offensive line, and I think that those philosophies should have been switched.
Yeah, the fact that this team saw CJ, and I totally agree with what he was saying. Did Stroud regress compared to his rookie year? Of course. Was it his fault? No, it's because of the egregious support. Not all on him. The support system was tough what he was going through all last year, and yet they still won a playoff game, and I do think he elevated them as a franchise quarterback. For that team to see what happened last year and then say, we're going to trade our franchise left tackle and Laramie Tunsil, whether he's expensive or not, to the Washington Commanders makes very little sense to me. And even the approach they took with the weapons, like really going all in on like day 2 receivers from Iowa State. Like, I like Higgins. I think he could be a good player, but I don't know, when you have a quarterback on a rookie deal, I wish they kind of would have took a bigger swing than that to try to support him this offseason. You're right, it was kind of a Moneyball approach, and I think that leads to a massive year 3 coming up, not for just Stroud, but for the Texans in general to find out who they are. Because, yeah, in a vacuum, the last 2 years, they have won a playoff game. I think they have one of the best secondaries and defenses overall in football. I think DeMeco Ryans a good coach, and Stroud is a top 10 quarterback. But if he regresses again, like, do they say Stroud needs to be the priority, not, getting to the first round like a Steelers-like team, second round? Like, we need more, and to do that, we need to support Stroud better. And is DeMeco Ryan on the hot seat at that point? Like, this is a massive year to find out who Houston is.
100%. The Texans kind of remind me right now of like a broken Nintendo. You got it plugged into the electrical outlet. That's in. It's plugged into the back of the box. You got the red, the white, the yellow cords all plugged into the front of your TV. Your controller's hooked in. You blew in the game a million times. You put it in. Why isn't this working? It's like everything looks good for the Texans, but they just don't look good doing it. It's like, why isn't this working? Everything looks in place, and the offensive line is the answer. So, like you said, to trade Laramie Tunsil and then sign Cam Robinson after the disaster in Minnesota in the back half of the year, and then you got Blake Fisher at right tackle, who, pretty good prospect out of Notre Dame, but is he ready to do that right away? Titus Howard still inside. Trent Brown, Ed Ingram, Laken Tomlinson. You're really trying to use a ton of journeyman guys. And again, Moneyball this thing. And I just think if they took the resources they trade for Christian Kirk, like you said, both the Iowa State wide receivers in the mid-rounds, if they took that approach with the offensive line and switched how they did things, I would feel better about it.
I agree, because C.J. Stroud is someone that's proven that even with, inconsistency at wide receiver and a lot of injuries, that he can elevate. He can be that guy. Last year, they were kind of a mess, and yet they still won a playoff game. I think taking the offensive line away, or kind of even reducing that weak unit with even less talent this year, just was such a strange approach. And I guess in a vacuum, they could still win the South with the roster that they have. Yep. They could probably still beat a Chargers or Broncos caliber team in the wild card, or who they beat in the Joe Flacco-led Cleveland Browns 2 years ago. But they keep running into a team like the Kansas City Chiefs in the second round, or the Baltimore Ravens in the second round, and they don't have the heavyweight fighters around C.J. Stroud to compete with those teams. It's very similar to Atlanta, almost kind of in the opposite way. I believe in Stroud. I believe in the quarterback.
Yes.
But I don't really believe in the roster on offense. I like their defense. But on offense, it hasn't been enough, because when another team is hot on offense, Stroud just doesn't have the guys to go toe-to-toe. So that's a big thing, and they're taking a unique approach. We'll see if it pays off. It's very projection-based, but I still believe in Stroud. I don't think the regression last year was really on him. He was kind of running for his life the majority of the year.
I mean, you saw, hey, if we give this guy time, he's going to slice up defenses. He's that good and has that natural arm ability, which we've always seen with C.J. Stroud. And your answer to that was to, go cheap and with the offensive line and spend a ton of resources at wide receiver, and it's
Tyler,
the
they haven't
Bengals
paid Stroud yet. That's the weird part. Why are they trying to penny pinch right now? I don't quite understand that.
And you already have Nico Collins, so it's you have a number one dominant receiver who's probably a top 10 wide receiver in the NFL right now, hands down. And it's you can afford to, you have a big stake on the plate already at wide receiver. You can afford to maybe go with canned green beans and, some creamed corn on the side. You can afford to do that because you paid for your steak. But when you don't have the steak and you got a Salisbury steak on the plate, and then you go instant mashed potatoes and canned green beans, now we got a problem. Now I'm not as happy. So it'll be interesting to see. But you made a comment a couple of minutes ago that I've kind of been knocking on the door a little bit with. If the Texans take a step back, let's say they don't make the playoffs. Let's say they go 9-8, miss the playoffs by a game. What are the conversations around DeMeco Ryans? And if C.J. Stroud has a year like last year instead of year one, again, then does C.J. Stroud's career and getting him back to the level you think does that become more important to the Texans than kind of running in place in the treadmill they're at? Those are the questions that could be asked this time next offseason.
And it's not even just if they miss the playoffs. I think it could go farther than that. Even if they make it to the playoffs and they lose in the first round, and they get a playoff win, but they lose in the second round and Stroud still looks like he did last year, I'm still, Tyler, making that move. Unless they got to get to the Final Four to have Stroud look like that and make me say DeMeco Ryans is safe. If C.J. Stroud looks like he did last year, I'm sorry, I don't care about one playoff win. That's not enough. You have to prioritize Stroud because he's your golden goose. He's going to be the reason you get to the Final Four. You eventually get to the Super Bowl one day. I think DeMeco Ryans is a good enough coach. He's a floor raiser. I think he's somebody good enough with a great defense to win a playoff game even without a Stroud type. But that's never going to get you far enough. Stroud's going to be that guy. So he's got to be the priority. You can't let instant team success kind of trump the long-term future of championships. And so, I think it's again, a massive season for Houston in year 3 to kind of determine what route they're going to take moving forward.
And like always, D'Amico Ryans, great coach, good defensive mind, good leader of men, can lead a locker room, all of that. But getting offensive coordinator right for those defensive coaches is just so difficult to do, and you'll get run out of town if you don't do it not only once, but multiple times. And it's very, very difficult. But we talk about the Texans maybe taking a step back. Who could be the team that takes a step forward? I think it might be the Jacksonville Jaguars. All right, Louis, let's cap off today's edition of Locked On NFL, doing our biggest question series, and it's crazy. We are up through 20 teams as of today's episode. Actually, right now, we have done 20 teams in the NFL with, does that leave 12 to go? But we're going to get into the Jacksonville Jaguars because, Louis, as much as it pains me to say it, look, I can talk about NFL teams and I can put my bias at the door. I like the Titans anyway. What is there to be biased about? You know, I know that they're not any good. But it is most difficult with the Jacksonville Jaguars. I have a long-standing, and the Titans have a long-standing rivalry with Jacksonville and their fans. And me and Tony Wiggins from Locked On NFL in the afternoon, check out the Barbershop episode later today. But me and Tony Wiggins always have our little back and forths about the different teams. But I have to be honest, even though I don't like it, I think Jacksonville has course corrected in the right way. And quite honestly, I'm surprised how their offseason began with firing Doug Peterson, but not Trent Baalke. I'm surprised that the Jags have been as smart as they've been since then. And it's funny, my guy Tony Wiggins, although I'm going to hate to hear it, he sees the same thing.
Another reason is I think the biggest part of what they did was what they undid, as opposed to what they actually did. And they wouldn't have, the biggest thing that they did was get Travis Hunter, in my opinion. They would not have done that had they not totally undid something prior to that. And that's where I want to sit right here for a minute. This is what I believe the turning point for this organization. And these little small moves don't seem to sometimes resonate with people, but they do when you think about them in totality. They fired Doug Peterson first. When they decided on a Zoom call that they were going to keep Trent Baalke, I thought that was a huge mistake because I didn't feel that they would then do the requisite things that they have now done that has us all so enthusiastic about next season.
I didn't think they'd do those things either, Louis, but they did. I love the trade for Travis Hunter. On draft night, you can go back. I said the Browns were losers because I did not like trading back for the Browns and passing up the opportunity to have Travis Hunter. I thought that was a smart move by Jacksonville, even though they had to give up a first next year. You add him in. Brian Thomas Jr., although that's a Trent Baalke move that he deserves credit for, Brian Thomas Jr. is a phenomenal player and probably going to be, he's like a top 10 wide receiver almost already with the yardage he put up last year. I love the talent they have on defense, especially on the defensive line with Josh Hines-Allen and Travon Walker. And I just think that the Jags, I don't think that they're incredible. I don't think that they're going to turn it around and be a true contender or anything. But I think where no matter who wins it, I'm not going to believe in them, AFC South.
Yep.
I think the Jags can fight back. And like I said, if the Texans go 9-8, they go 8-9, take a small step back, Jacksonville can take that step forward. And I think they can be the team that wins the AFC South with 9 or 10 wins.
Yeah, when you talk about the long-term future of the AFC South, the team I like outside of Houston that's building something are your Tennessee Titans. But for me in 2025, if the Texans did regress, like you mentioned earlier, and they don't make the playoffs, who's the team that upends them in the division to win the title? I do think it's Jacksonville. And I agree with you. I don't think the Jaguars are a Super Bowl contender. I don't even think Trevor Lawrence is going to be ever the prospect that we thought he was, the next Andrew Luck coming out of Clemson. But I will say there's a middle ground between that and who he was last year. I do think who we saw in 2022, 2023, the first half of the year when they were like 8-3 before he got hurt, I do think that's closer to the player he is than what they got last year. And I think they believe that too, and they're doubling down by. They gave up a lot, but I agree with you. I love the Travis Hunter move. Now with Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter, there is very little excuses for Lawrence. And they brought in Liam Cohen, who, yeah, he had a goofy first press conference, but as somebody that's covered the Eagles, Doug Peterson and Nick Sirianni both had terrible intro press conferences, and they both won championships in Philadelphia. So for me, Cohen, his track record, what he did with Baker Mayfield in Tampa Bay, you add that on top of bringing in Hunter, bringing in Brian Thomas last year.
Yeah.
I think Lawrence is I think he's a bounce back. Like, I don't know if he can, is he considered a comeback player of the year candidate? But I think he's like one of those guys that's going to bounce back a lot this year.
Yeah, I don't think he was to the point where they would give him comeback player of the year, but I understand like the spirit of what you're saying is he could make a big difference. Like you could see, Trevor Lawrence jumping up and being a top 10 quarterback.
Like one of the biggest jumps from last year to this year, I think could be Lawrence.
In terms of play, but I think for the Jags, the biggest question is, did they correct things? And I think they have. You're right. I do like the Liam Cohen hire, even with the Duval.
That was bad. I'm not going to lie. That was brutal. It almost talked me out of him. So.
Yeah. Some of these guys just quite aren't ready for the attention that they're going to get when they become a head man in the NFL. And Cohen, that doesn't mean that he can't be a good head coach. But you add Cohen, you add Gladstone. I think that even if these things don't work out necessarily, they're the right moves. They made the right moves. They did the right things to get themselves back on track and kind of 180 the organization. And I've always kind of believed that the Jags have more talent than what their record shows, and that was especially true last year. If we did have one big question about Jacksonville, though, it is, again, like with Houston, the offensive line, which we could say that about so many teams in the NFL because it's so hard to find good offensive line play right now, which is why the teams with great offensive lines are dominant, like Detroit, like Philadelphia, of course. But you look at that offensive line, Anton Harrison, former first-round pick. He was okay last year. Is he going to take that step up? They brought in Patrick McCarry and Robert Hainsey in free agency to add to the interior. I loved Wyatt Milam out of West Virginia as a third-round pick. I think he could be a starter for them by season's end. Ezra Cleveland and Walker Little on the other side. That left side right there, that's what I'm most concerned with because Ezra Cleveland has had up and down years going back to Minnesota. They make the trade to get him. Walker Little just got a new deal. He's okay. I would call him a replacement level left tackle. I think next year in the draft they could maybe be looking to replace him, but it's all about that offensive line and whether they can support Trevor Lawrence because we know everywhere else on the roster they basically have the talent that they need to make the playoffs.
And the offensive line is the big issue. But I will say, like, the coaching really held back Trevor Lawrence, I think, over the last year and a half. And as much as I appreciate what Doug Peterson did for Philadelphia, and he got the most out of Carson Wentz and Nick Foles in 2017, him and Press Taylor, who's gotten him kind of fired twice now in two different cities, they did not help Trevor Lawrence continue to ascend off what he did in 2022. Just like Carson Wentz, a lot of that was Wentz's fault, that downfall after 2019. But Doug Peterson and Press Taylor were not really the answers there. So I do think they made the right the priority this offseason was we're going to give Trevor Lawrence the best chance to succeed. And now if he doesn't, it's kind of on him. I kind of like that they put all their chips into the center here. So we'll see what happens. I don't think they're a championship contender, but do I think they could compete in the South? Do I think they could compete for a wild card, a 6 or 7 seed, kind of like Denver and Los Angeles last year? Yeah, I think you could make the argument they're on a similar tier.
Funny, Doug Peterson is like a good director with a terrible writer.
Yeah.
It's that's a good plan
but he
for
won't
a film.
Quit him. He just won't.
Like
he's
some
so
of these
loyal
shots,
to him.
But man, that script is awful. But he just won't quit him. But
Nope.
either way, new era in Jacksonville, and sadly, I'm pretty high on what they can do this season. But with that being said, that is going to do it for today's edition of Locked On NFL. I am your host, the Madman Tyler Rowland, for my co-host, the Legacy Louis DiBiase, as we tell you every single episode. Thanks for tuning in, and stay safe out there.